Give the shuffling there as we take it in turns to sit that a little bit closer. So what I have to say to you this morning, sorry about this, complements the reflection in today's printed Worship at Home resource. And that says at the very beginning that it makes no attempt to explain the somewhat puzzling and could be taken as disturbing words of Jesus to this woman, this Canaanite woman. And I felt very strongly as I was reading this particular passage that actually that's what I was going to do this morning, try and go some way to explain those words, because at first value, Jesus seems to be very, very insulting. And it's not, with the current situation going on, we're very aware of the power of words and words that we shouldn't say and how we shouldn't speak. And it's wrong to speak in derogatory manner about other people regarding their race. And it just didn't quite sit really that here was Jesus doing just what appears to be just that. And I know it's a different time and a different place, but that just didn't quite sit with the Jesus that we know and we love from the rest of the Gospels. So I felt that certainly this morning, part of what I wanted to say was going to be focused on that. Really just what was he saying and why was he saying those words, and just that the whole context of that particular interaction. This whole portion of the Bible, chapter 15, and to an extent chapter 14 before it, is this continuous and recurring theme of food, because in chapter 14 Jesus feeds the 5,000, and then he walks on water, and Peter, if you remember, starts out walking on water, realizes what he's doing, and then sinks because the realization is suddenly, oh my goodness, I'm walking on water, I shouldn't be, and then he sinks. And Jesus says to him, oh, have you no faith? Or words to that effect. And then in chapter 15 today, at the very beginning, we find the Pharisees under attack from Jesus because of their focus on the outward adherence to rules which were designed to show that the Jews belong to God, rather than focusing on an attitude of heart which actually characterizes the people. And what they were being castigated for was their obsession with washing their hands to make them clean before they could eat their food. I mean, we know a lot about washing of hands, but this was a sort of a ritual. The food was unclean if you didn't wash your hands in this particular ritualistic way. So we've got this idea of food. And coming into that is this idea of actually the Pharisees hadn't quite got it right, because they were relying on these outward rules to make them right with God, rather than what was going on in their hearts. So the Pharisees criticized Jesus' followers over their hygiene. And then Jesus replies to them, actually, what makes people unclean doesn't come from what they put into their mouths, but from what is in their hearts and what they say out of their mouths, and obviously from what their heart is telling them what they do. So that's what actually makes a person unclean, not whether or not they've washed their hands before they put some food in their mouths. Jesus explains at the beginning, further on in chapter 15, his saying about food, and then goes on to say that people demonstrate they're unclean by actually what they say and how they treat other people. And of course, paradoxically, by religiously following the outward rules, which they hope will demonstrate their undeniable place among God's people, rather than the state of their inner heart, the Pharisees actually miss out on all of God's blessings and the favour that they so desire. So in their attempt to secure their place in God's kingdom, actually they are putting themselves in a place where they won't receive that, because their heart is in the wrong place and they've got their focus completely wrong. So then, with all of that background of this idea of food and things going into your mouths, and also a bit of faith coming into it, and what makes you belong to God. So these threads are all coming into this story. So then we come to Jesus' encounter with the Canaanite woman. And that shares this same interplay between eating, between physical food, which later on it talks about crumbs, and inward food, God's favour and his blessings, which of course is what the Pharisees were so desperate for, but were going the wrong way about it. And those things, that inward food is enjoyed by those who belong to him. Unlike the Pharisees, however, she knows she is outside of God's favour by virtue of who she is and her nationality. So she knows that from the outset, that she's not considered to be one of God's people. Yet, she shows her faith in Jesus, that he will be able to grant her God's blessing, which she doesn't feel she deserves, but she knows and has faith that he will be able to do that, grant her God's blessings by healing her daughter. And in the end, it's actually she who receives God's blessing. It's she who is commended for her great faith. And it's she who is welcomed into God's kingdom because of that faith. So you've got this great sort of paradox. Those that think they're there and are trying desperately to prove that they're there actually aren't there at all, the Pharisees. And the woman who knows she's not a part of God's kingdom, actually, it's not so much being part of God's kingdom she wants, but she believes and trusts in Jesus that God will deliver her. And she shows the one with great faith, and it's she who finds favour with God. So the woman comes from an area and a people who've been historically enemies of the Jewish nation. She's a Gentile, and she knows that as far as the Jews are concerned, she is no more likely than a dog to receive God's favour and blessing. That's where this idea of a dog comes into it. They thought, well, we are the only ones, and how could some animal like a dog, or it could have been a cow, it could have been any other animal, but they've said dog. Foreigners, pagans, are just as likely as a dog to receive God's blessing, and that's the attitude that the Jews had. But Jesus, a Jewish man, a Jewish rabbi, has deliberately come into Gentile territory, presumably on a mission. So he's put himself within her environment, and she feels empowered enough to ask a miracle of him, and persists in asking him to the point that the disciples tell him to make her go away. We don't actually, in that reading that Rachel did, Jesus, it's almost as if we're just having little snapshots of the conversations that were going on. The woman comes to him and puts her request. He doesn't answer her, but presumably we don't hear about it. She carries on asking, please, and goes on and cries after them because she is desperate for God's blessing and the miracle. Still, Jesus is not answering, and the disciples get a bit fed up with this and say, oh, for goodness sake, do something and make her go away, shut her up somehow. And he replies to them, I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. So he refuses her request. And then by his reply to the disciples, actually, he lets her know that the Jews, who are God's children, were to have the first opportunity to accept him as the Messiah. Because from time immemorial, from way back at the beginning of the Bible, it was the Jewish nation who would share God's message of salvation to the world. But perhaps emboldened by the fact that this Jewish man had actually engaged with her and spoken to her, she gets on her knees again and begs for his help. Strictly speaking, in those days, a woman never, ever approached a man in public and spoke to them. And if they were a foreigner, well, that was sort of beyond the pale. That it just did not happen. So, but she feels emboldened enough to get on her knees and beg for his help. Although it seems at first reading that Jesus is actually degrading her by choosing to address her as a usual Jewish man would, calling her a dog, He then goes on to show her by his words and his deeds that actually that's not his opinion of either her or her people. It's as if he was saying to her, well, look, you're a Gentile, I'm a Jew. The Jews call themselves children of God, but you, because you are a Gentile, they vilify and they abuse, calling you a dog, referring to you as a dog. So are you actually willing to receive of a Jew then a favour? Are you willing to submit to these names, being called a dog, to receive a favour from one of that nation? And to acknowledge that actually you depend on a people that despise you. That's what he's really saying to her. And so rather than him actually full on insulting her, it seems therefore that actually perhaps it's a trial of her faith rather than him giving his sanction to an abusive term. So what's the woman's reply? Well, unlike many people today, it's I don't know about you, but lots of people I know take offence at the slightest thing. You say one, you can say one word and it's just come out wrong, but oh no, they've taken great offence and have gone off in a bit of a high dudgeon, and then it's a great, it's all blown out of proportion, and it's a great effort to get that relationship back on track. I'm quite sure that either you've been the recipient of that, or you've felt that, or you've witnessed that. So that's, I think, perhaps what would be a human reaction to somebody apparently insulting you to your face. But it's also true that whilst we're quick to take offence, because of our social, the way we interact with each other, and what we mean is not always just what we say, the words that come out of our mouth. It's all to do with who the person is, or how they're looking at you, the expression in their voice. All of those things can actually mitigate what would at first sight, written on paper, seem an insult. I know certainly in my own, people have said something to me which the actual words have been very hurtful, very insulting, but I've known I've not taken it as an insult, because I know them, I know what our relationship is, and I know that actually it's meant in a teasing way. Whether that's right or wrong is neither here nor there, but it was never meant, in all seriousness, it was never meant to insult. And so I've not taken it as an insult. So we've got those two sort of, I think, very human things which she could have done. And how does she actually react? Well, she didn't argue with him at all, and she certainly didn't seem to take any offence, but seems to be acutely aware that actually, as a non-Jew, she may not deserve anything of God's grace and favour at all. And it's as if she is replying to him by saying, well, yes, I confess the Jews are the children in this story. I know that I'm a pagan and called a dog, and not at all a part of God's household. And it's true that it seems unreasonable that if we accept that, I'm a dog, and therefore, why should I, a dog, be served before all the children are fed and filled? But then she says, but Lord, remember that in the country that we know, in the circumstances and the social standings that we know, actually the dogs, the physical dogs, are permitted to eat the crumbs which have fallen from the table. Those bits that are left behind, the dogs are allowed to eat. And therefore, I know that you have such an abundance of grace and blessing that the children may all be filled, and yet there will still remain some crumbs that I may have too. She agreed to be considered a dog if she could receive God's blessing for her daughter and for herself. And it's ironic, really, isn't it, that many Jews would lose God's blessing and salvation because, in fact, they rejected Jesus. And yet many Gentiles after her would find salvation because they recognized and accepted him. So where does that leave us with that explanation or hope of this term of a dog, and why it wasn't actually as insulting as it might seem in first reading? Well, the story's one of hope, isn't it, to us? And it's a hope of hope, and yet also of warning. It's a hope. The hope is that all people can know the love and salvation of God, even if actually none of us has a right to expect it. There's a hope that if we are persistent in prayer and supplication, God will answer us. And there's a hope that in the reputation of God that goes before him, and that we know he delights to answer our prayers. There's hope that in this life and in the next, we can walk all our days in his presence. This story gives us the reassurance that even though we don't deserve any of that, all of those things are open if we have faith in him. But this story has warnings too for us. It warns us that we would be wise not to lose sight of what really matters in the kingdom of God. Not to become caught up with things that don't matter, rules that we have put in place rather than stemming from the Bible and from Scripture. The Pharisees were focused on all of those additional rules, and it distracted them from finding their true place as God's children, because their hearts weren't in the right place. They were too focused on the externals, for looking good, appearing to be religious, because they thought those were the things that would bring them to that closeness with God, to be part of his family, to live in communion with him. So it's wise for us not to lose sight of what really matters in God's kingdom. As I've said earlier, it also exhorts us not to take offence, not to give up if we think we're being ignored, and when others try to put us off. The Canaanite woman certainly was ignored by Jesus in the first instance. The disciples tried to put her off, and she could so easily have taken offence. But it reminds us, look above that, rise above that, and don't take no for an answer. And it warns us not to be blinded or scandalised by the outward signs or appearance of others in those little things. Rather, to look at what they do and what they say through God's lens. And to remember that God has not come just to save us. He actually came to save the whole world, because all can be saved. And to remember actually that a great deal of our world is nothing, and its people is nothing at all like you and like me. And to remember that, because I think we do tend to just think we bring down God's kingdom to what we know and what we experience in our small group, rather than remembering actually there's an awful lot of world out there that culturally is very, very different from us. And whilst what they do might not sit easily with us, we have to look beyond those things that don't sit easily with us and look for the kingdom values that are in there, and not be blinded by our own prejudices. And finally, I wonder how many of you recognise some of the words of the communion service in this interchange. That was one of the things that really struck me. And I was struck anew quite powerfully by the fact that actually we too are like this Gentile woman. By nature, we are not the hereditary children of God. We are not the favoured. We are not the favoured race. We are not the favoured person. We are like this Gentile woman. We are the dogs in this story. Those who don't deserve that first picking. We've no right on our own to be considered his child. And we are undeserving of God's great riches, mercy and blessings, fit only really to gather up the crumbs that lie under the table. But, there's a big but, faith in God's great mercy and encompassing love brings us to a share of those crumbs through which we can know and experience the fullness of God and the eternal hope that is God's kingdom. Because actually, crumbs of God's love, crumbs of God's mercy, crumbs of God's compassion, crumbs of everything that God has got to offer you are actually far more than anything that we need. So we only actually need the crumbs because that will provide so much more than we need. We need to remember that. Crumbs are all we need. As I was preparing all of this, I was what came to my attention was some music that I don't listen to because I don't like that style of music. It's not for me. But by ignoring a style of music, by ignoring someone from a totally different background, something that I have no connection with really at all, I'm missing out, or I've missed out on someone else's experience of God, which is very different from my experience of God. I was really quite surprised, and we're going to play this very, very shortly, Juliet, just as a warning. The artist Stormzy, okay? We've sort of seen him at Glastonbury parading around the stage. We know that a lot of the songs that he sings contain an awful lot of bad language, and I don't know what you're like, but anything that contains a lot of swearing, I just switch off. He comes from an inner city. Obviously he's a coloured man, so he comes from a completely different community. He speaks in a different way. His concerns are different to my concerns, and all in all, his way of life and everything that he encompasses, everything that he represents, is very different from me. And I will be guilty here of doing what I've just told you all not to do, or to try to avoid doing. You know, by what I've just said to you, I've been focusing on those things that don't really matter. Not in the final run of things. They don't really matter so much. What does matter is what's in his heart and what he says to a lot of people that he is able to reach because of his experience. So I'm afraid I've been blinded and I've been scandalized by outward signs and appearances. And I will apologize to that. I was quite taken aback because I didn't really particularly think that I was that sort of person, but I obviously am, because a lot of these things that we're scandalized by are things that have become quite ingrained within us. And whilst they're not particularly serious, they do blind us to aspects of God that we wouldn't normally see. So I'm going to finish this morning by playing us one of Stormzy's songs, Blinded by Your Grace. I'm hoping it's going to play because I've got the words and I'm not really very good at rapping. So I do hope that it will play, because if you've got to listen to me attempting to rap, then I think the impact will go over your heads and you'll wish I hadn't really bothered. But I was just struck by this whole situation, that this was such a good example of what was going on in that story, what Jesus, I think, is telling us as part of that not to be like. So we're going to listen to Blinded by Your Grace by Stormzy, Juliet, please.